Welcome to Grace Lee's virtual town hall. We do this every Sunday at 4 o'clock. We have special guest Basil Smikle with us today. We'll be having a discussion about how the coronavirus is impacting our democracy. If at any time you want to ask a question, you have two options. You can type it in the chat and Grace will get to it, or you can raise your hand and we'll put you on. If you're joining us by phone, if you hit *9 at any time, that's the same thing as raising your hand, and we'll be sure to get to you. So without further ado, we have Grace Lee on our Zoom chat. Hey, Grace.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on Sunday. It's beautiful weather out, so I appreciate you, being with me today. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Basil Smikle. He is a lecturer of public policy at Columbia University and also the former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. And, I've been talking with a lot of people in the community. A few weeks ago, we had a doctor on about speaking about medical issues with coronavirus. And people said, oh, we don't really want to talk about coronavirus so much anymore. And thought it was a good opportunity to bring Basil on to talk about our democracy and what coronavirus means for elections in the 2020 cycle. This is obviously an important area where we've got, I'm running, of course, but also, this is a presidential year, so this is important for us to be paying attention. So thank you, Basil, for coming.
It's my pleasure. Happy to do this. It was exciting.
So let's talk about the Wisconsin Democratic primary that happened earlier this month. This was actually the first primary to take place during shelter-in-place orders nationwide. There was a lot of controversy over it, obviously, and it went up to the state Supreme Court as to whether or not this election should take place. Can you talk about the dynamics that were at play?
Sure. No, that's absolutely. It's great to start with that question because it really does frame the dynamic that I think will be a recurring theme for the rest of this election cycle. You had a president who has historically, if you go back to when he was, early in his administration, created this sort of sham voter fraud commission, which was allegedly supposed to look into what little voter fraud actually exists. And the sort of consistent theme from the White House, from him, was essentially to tamp down voter activity among constituencies in communities and in states that obviously were not going to be very supportive of him. So as we are now in the sort of the midst of the stay-at-home rules and regulations throughout the country, Wisconsin, among other states, are thinking through ways, and Wisconsin had thought through, and other states are thinking through ways to increase voter access so that you do not you do not tamp down a vote and you don't discourage people from coming out. So as Wisconsin is dealing with this and thinking about mail-in elections, you have the president who is openly and vehemently actually against that. That should not come as a surprise to anyone because of what I just said, but also I think there are multiple states, if I remember correctly, 28 states going into 2018 had laws on the books that actually in some way, shape, or form restrict voter access. So you're meeting all of these different all of these things are sort of coming together at the same time. The confluence of all of these events and all of these this activity that's been taking place now trains its focus on Wisconsin. And what we saw in Wisconsin was interesting. There was a decrease in the vote. And if you think about it from the point of view of a voter, just think about yourself for a minute. What are you going to be more or less comfortable doing at a time like this? Are you going to be comfortable going out and waiting online and with a lot of other people standing next to you and around you? How long do you feel comfortable doing that? I don't blame the voter necessarily, because I think every individual at this point is going to have have concerns about what being around other folks for an extended period of time is going to do for them, for their health, and so on and so forth. But from the sort of government standpoint and from the small d democratic standpoint, we did see a decrease in turnout as a result of this. And 80% of the votes that did come in came in by mail. 80%. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the fact that 5 states have very robust mail-in voting vehicle apparatus right now, with Washington included, which also experimented with online voting. So when you see that only 5 states have a very robust mail-in operation, and I have a stat on this, only 28 states have no excuses mail-in voting. 17 states have strict rules about who can actually get an absentee ballot, New York included. But some of those states, including New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, have also loosened some of those restrictions. So we have a ways to go in terms of trying to make this a national program. But if Wisconsin is a test case, we'll see that there is significant interest in voting by mail, but it does face substantial headwinds from many corners of conservatives, including the president himself.
Right, that's good to know. And if we're still maintaining social distancing in June, when we're going to have our primary, that's going to change the number of polling booths that we can have in a room. It's going to increase the lines and the wait times for people who actually want to go and vote. I mean, it really even changes the in-person voting dynamic and people's experiences and ability to get out. I think that's, you make a great point about, looking at Wisconsin and thinking about where we are in New York. We're one of the most progressive states in the country, yet our absentee or our vote by mail system is not particularly robust. If you want to vote absentee, you need to have an excuse or a reason for needing to vote. Although Governor Cuomo did sign an executive order recently, can you talk a little bit about that?
So what the governor did was loosen the restrictions such that you don't have to give the kinds of excuses that you would normally have to give. You can just, say, I think, sick or related to illness. I think is one of 2 options that you can use, and the suggestion is that you would use that. And you no longer have to do that in person, which was also a prior requirement. If you compare where New York is to, say, other states like Alabama that actually requires, no matter what you do, to vote in person on the day of election, New York hasn't been that restrictive, but there had been widespread concern that because of the restrictions that do exist in New York, we were going to our ability to go out and cast a vote, particularly in an election as important as this for so many voters, was going to be a concern. So I'm glad that the governor did act. I know that there is a push for more to be done. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit, if I may. If you think about what some states have been doing up until their primaries this year, and will probably continue to do, you have some, where do we vote now? We vote in schools, we vote in other places where a lot of people congregate, right? And so we're not so sure what's going to be reopened and how and so on and so forth by the time we actually go to cast our vote. But there is going to be concern that you're going to go to the poll on that day, and you're going to see extraordinarily long lines. That there are going to be polling sites that may be shut down, because that's happened in other states. We'll see what happens here in New York. There are polling sites that might be shut down or moved altogether, or some that will just be moved. And folks are going to have to go through higher hurdles to be able to actually cast their vote. Some of these things happen regardless, right? There's always a percentage of voters that go through this on every election, but the concern is that we will see this as a more widespread challenge for the entire state going into this primary. So, the folks at the Board of Elections who I've worked with in the past, who do phenomenal work, are really going to have a big challenge just getting information out about what voters should be doing on election day. And if I can take it a step forward, as there is a push to increase opportunities across the country for mail-in votes and sort of to be able to expand that. So it's not just an absentee ballot that you're filling out, that more New Yorkers have the ability to cast their vote by mail. And this becomes especially important if we, God forbid, see another wave of the virus resurging and more stay-at-home orders. There's going to be more of a push for this. Think about what has to happen. You have to have somebody's going to have to design a ballot to be actually mailed out. There's going to be questions about whether or not the post office can get the ballots out and then get them back to the folks that need to count them in time, in a good time. Those days of, getting results at 9:15 at night are going to be over. The counting of those ballots is a challenge because the machines that we normally use to count, to register your vote, can't be used to count these kinds of mail-in votes. Those machines cost between $500,000 and $1 million a piece. So the question is, who gets those machines? Is there one in every county? What's that going to look like? So there are challenges that I think lie ahead, even if we're going to, as a state, expand the opportunity to mail in your vote. Should we do this? I think we absolutely should. Should we spend that money? Absolutely. I think it's worth it in the long run. But we know how government is sometimes, and we know that the wheels turn very, very slowly, and that there's politics on both sides that may create hurdles. But I think there's going to be much more conversation that pushes us in that direction.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point because in the Wisconsin primary, you said 80% of the votes were absentee. So even if we don't, I know there's a call for 100% mail-in ballots, but even if we are looking at just expanding absentee ballots, that you're saying that the state doesn't really have the infrastructure in place to be able to handle it at this point. And there's I'm excited the group chat's already lighting up with questions for you. And that's a question that Daniel has posed is, he's saying, even if New York has loosened restriction, how is the state going to make absentee voting work in the immediate future with so limited time to set up the necessary infrastructure? Right. What does that process look like? And, from the perspective of the state Democratic Party all the way through like the BOE and everything.
So, by the way, most states don't have the infrastructure to do this. This is a national problem. And I want to be clear about that. This is a national problem that I actually do think Democrats can take the lead on, both nationally and in New York State. When I was ED of the party, I think as I was leaving the party and then shortly thereafter, the state committee was talking a lot about trying to expand voter access, which is why you got the push for, and you had this prior to that, but that's why you started to see things like early voting and so on start to get legislated, particularly as we had a more progressive legislature get elected, and the end of that IDC, which is another story altogether. But you started to see a lot of these changes to liberalize and make our voting process more progressive. So I think individual state parties play a huge role in this, because remember, the Constitution says that states have the ability to set the timing and the manner of their elections. And so there's I don't think anybody has an appetite for Congress mandating a sort of a national, you can't do it without amendments to the Constitution, but there are going to be states that are going to feel very uncomfortable having Congress set sort of national policy. But I think what individual state Democratic parties can do is push their legislators to set aside more funding to create the infrastructure that allows us to get to closer to 100% ability to do mail-in voting. Right now, as you said, the states do not have that infrastructure. It costs a tremendous amount of money. We really haven't seen as big, aside from changes in early voting here in New York, we really haven't seen a big push for changes in how we conduct elections since the Help America Vote Act that came after the 2000 election, and with the sort of the Bush-Gore debacle, if you will. And so this would require and be a substantial national push to really reform the way we actually conduct our elections. But as I said, because states figure this out individually, each state party has a role in pushing their legislature and their governors, their statewide electeds, to reform those policies. And this, unfortunately, what political scientists call they call it a focusing event. This COVID-19 and these stay-at-home orders, this focuses our attention on gaps in our institutions, and this is a substantial gap in our institution that's taking place in one of the biggest election cycles in modern history. So if there was ever a time to do this, it's now.
So as we're thinking about New York State and expanding to perhaps a 100% mail-in ballot, one, I'd like to know kind of where the legislature's head is in terms of thinking about that. And then second, because I know there are a number of proposals out, and second, so it may not even be an issue. Part of the consideration, even if there's the political will to get this done, that there is the infrastructure may just make it, would it make it impossible? Or do you think that we can get there by June 23rd?
No, I don't think we can get there by June 23rd, but that's just my gut. That's just my guess.
For the primary, but by fall?
Right. For the primary, maybe by fall, but because I do think you can do this over the next several months, but I don't know that we can get there by June. It's going to require purchasing different kinds of equipment. It's going to require the changing of the ballots themselves, the rewriting of the ballots themselves. It's going to require the recruitment of thousands of volunteers, many more than we would normally have on election day. So the apparatus, the infrastructure is the word we've been using, I think needs to be ramped up quite substantially. And so if everything worked perfectly, then maybe we could do that by June. I don't see that. That's generally not our history, but there is time to do that by the November election. I would also add that it's not just the sort of physical requirements, right? It's also voter education, and I think a tremendous amount of time needs to be spent. And if you're talking about the Democratic Party, I would say, particularly by the state committee members, by the county chairs, to be able to go out and talk to voters about their options in terms of voting, the changes that are taking place. In a couple of years, we're going to be dealing with ranked choice voting, which is going to require another sort of set of another type of education around what that means. So if we're going to do it, now is the absolute time to do it. And in terms of the legislature, I think this is why this is, I think, a critical moment, is because we have a very progressive legislature. I touched on the IDC earlier. There had been, and I'm sure everybody knows that's in part of this town hall right now. We know what the IDC was, the Independent Democratic Conference, those Democrats that caucused with Republicans. They were, in many ways, a sort of counterbalance to what Democrats in the Senate and the Assembly have been proposing. You don't have that anymore. They've been defeated. That conference is gone. You have a legislature that is far more progressive than we've seen in decades in this state. So I do think with a sound proposal, you can find the funding and the support to get this done. And I would caution, this one caution, if in some stroke we can do this by the time our primary gets here, there are going to be bumps in the road. But the fact that we are moving in that direction in and of itself is a victory, I think, for all of us. But I think in terms of the legislature, we have enough of a progressive legislature now that they should all be on board with this.
I have a question from Vanessa Mosley. The election is 7 months away. It seems there needs to be some contingency voting plan in place. Should folks just request for an absentee ballot now as a safeguard in case there's no plan?
Well, I think you should. I think you should be thinking along those lines, regardless. They're not. People are not going. Let me say it this way: not everyone is going to feel comfortable going to a polling site. I mean, that's just the reality. Not everybody's going to feel comfortable doing that. So I think it's. I think you. If you think, even if the governor set a May 15th time to sort of look in whether or not there should be loosening of the stay-at-home orders. Let's just say that happens in mid-May. There's still going to be people who are going to be really skittish a month later in terms of going out. So I think every voter should be looking to vote by mail. That's just my opinion, because you just never know what's going to happen by the end of June. So better to be safe than sorry, err on the side of caution, and that's how I would look at it.
Okay, great. And I've got one of my staffers is going to go ahead and drop the link for the absentee ballot into the chat, so everyone has access to that and can go straight to the application. I think one thing that's a little bit confusing, and just to point this out for people, is that voters may select temporary illness or physical disability as a reason for requesting an absentee ballot due to the potential of contracting COVID-19. So that is the checkbox reason that you would use if you just wanted to get an absentee ballot because you're concerned about coronavirus. But it's not clear. It's not necessarily clear. But temporary illness is the one that you can check off to get the ballot. But yeah, certainly, like you said, it is much easier now. You don't have to go in person. You can do the form online. So that's great to know. So I have another question from Kiara. How can we help, one, locally in New York City, and two, in battleground states around the presidential election regarding vote by mail, as grassroots organizers?
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. You know, the challenge in this environment right now is what I call the restrictions on campaign craft. So what do I mean by that? All those things that we do: knock on doors, go to our subway stops, hand out flyers on street corners, all of those things we can't do anymore. So I think I would hope that individual campaigns and state parties, and frankly, I'm not 100% sure what our state party is doing, and that's no shade to the state party, but I'm not sure if they've done this, but what I would like to do going forward is make sure, I would love to work on this to make sure that state parties across the country have set up the opportunity and ability for people to, from wherever they are in the country, you get on their cell phones and start calling voters. Now, we do this normally, right? We do this, state parties do this, campaigns do this when we normally have phone bank operations. I started in politics when you had to go to the local union hall with the actual phones that were dropped into the union hall and sit there for 10 hours making phone calls. Now everybody obviously can do it from their cell phone in their home. And so as long as individual campaigns and state parties have the ability to get you information, voter file information that is specific to the cities and the states that they care about, and I imagine and hope that if the state party hasn't done that here, that they will, that you can start calling individual voters and start to encourage them to get that absentee ballot, or to start thinking about how they want to vote on primary day. So, call the state party, and I'll certainly be an ally in that. If you need a little push, I'm happy to help everybody sort of push this issue to the forefront. But I do think just an ability to start calling voters, maybe even at a county level. Your county organization, Keith Wright, county chair here in New York County and Manhattan, and others across the state, if they have voter files, just talk to them and say, hey, we want to start educating voters about what their options are on primary day. And again, if that's not happening, I'm happy to be an ally to help push that issue across the state.
Yeah, and I'll just give a shout out to our phone banking app operation right now with my campaign. We are doing voter education and would love more volunteers to help expand our mutual aid network, where we're calling out to voters in the district or community members in the district just to make sure that they're okay and that they're aware of their ability to vote in different ways heading into the primary. And so if you're interested in that, go ahead and chat Nick Murphy. He can take your information. And also, I want to give a shout out to Richard Corman, who's the president of Downtown Independent Democrats, one of the largest Lower Manhattan Democratic clubs down here. And if people are interested, certainly look up DID. We're going to be hosting, they have their club meeting next week. Richard, if you can put some information down in the chat about that meeting and how to, connect with DID. They are very active in promoting just a more fluid democratic process. And they're always looking for new members who want to get engaged. Okay, so I have.
If I could just add very quickly also, you've got a lot of folks like Stacey Abrams and the groups that she runs, and I talked to Stacey Abrams often about the work that she had been doing. All of these, there are so many groups that are national groups that are working right now. That may have previously been working to, for example, pull down restrictions on voter access in multiple states, and in some ways have switched gears a little bit to start talking more about how to make sure state legislatures increase voter access in not necessarily in terms of ID laws, but in terms of this very issue of voting by mail. So there are national groups as well that might have turned their attention onto this, and also calling into battleground states to do it. But I'm a big believer in local politics, and I always tell people, as important and as appealing and sexy as presidential politics is, most of the policy that affects your day-to-day lives happens on the state level and local levels. So my big pitch is to call into and support your local Democratic clubs and your county leaders to do this work locally.
Okay, great. And so I've got just going to go back to the chat for some more questions. Let's see. Okay, it's from Jasper. I've worked on many campaigns over many years. I've never seen any in-person voter fraud, but I have been involved in several cases of issues with campaign meddling with absentee ballots, not with actual voters, but with ballots going missing on the county level. They were small local elections. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure. Listen, voter fraud, as the president and some conservatives talk about it, doesn't exist in the ways that in the ways that they're suggesting. There's no. That's a gaslight. It's a dog whistle. That is a way to gin up support for their causes and ways to tamp down. Particularly communities that are vulnerable, particularly seniors and voters of color and the poor. So the kind of voter fraud, and I know you're not saying this as the person who asked the question, I know you're not getting into this territory, but so we just don't have the national voter fraud that I think President Trump and others may have suggested. But do things slip through the cracks? Absolutely, and we see that in every election. And there would be a concern that mail-in voting, if we ramp up to 100% or close to 100% mail-in voting, that because that infrastructure is either non-existent or relatively new, that there are going to be challenges. And that's what I was saying earlier. I expect that there are going to be bumps in the road. I expect there are going to be problems. But it's more important than not that we make the attempt to go and to get to the place that we want to get to rather than not do it. Because it will ensure that people who really are focused on this election have the opportunity to cast their ballot. My big concern here is that for so many people who want to see a change, and I make this point, and I make this point to my students all the time, that when this president got elected, there were people that really started to understand the connection between politics and governance. That the president actually does appoint a lot of people. The president has the power of the executive authority to issue executive orders. So I had a lot of students come to me and say, man, can the president do that? And I'm like, yeah, the president can do that. That is within presidential power. And now more than ever, I think voters, and I don't mean the activists and the folks that go to Democratic club meetings, I mean sort of the day-to-day average voter who may not vote in every local election, but wants to vote in a presidential election, they're now much more focused on who's in charge because they understand who that person appoints to office. So I'm saying all of that to say that I think you're going to see substantial turnout all across the country, and in November. And I would rather us get to a place where we can make sure all of those votes are counted, as opposed to saying to folks, we're not ready yet, but, and then risk people saying, well, I'm just not going to vote because it's going to be too difficult to do so. The costs are too high, the burden is too substantial. That's my fear, that we're moving into that territory. And so even if there are going to be, if there is some slippage, if you will, it's really important to just move in that direction and to show voters that their leaders are willing to move in that direction.
Yeah, and that's a question that kind of segues perfectly to Vanessa's question about whether or not, we expect voter participation to be decreased in the upcoming election. I mean, maybe speaking to the primary, since that's very close and we may not have all of the, options in place for people to vote, and we may still be social distancing and sheltering in place at that time, who knows? Yeah. So be curious to kind of get your thoughts on that. And then also, secondly, also with a focus on COVID-19 pandemic, how you think about candidates and their platforms, and, because right now it doesn't seem like campaigning has that much life. Speaking from personal experience.
No, I get it. No, but, so let me answer that question first. Look, we're in a place right now where we have a nominee in Joe Biden. We have a presumptive nominee in Joe Biden. And again, I go back to the point I made earlier that we just don't have the campaign. You can't engage in a campaign craft that we normally do. He can't do rallies. He can do what we're doing now, but he can't do rallies. He can't barnstorm through states. We're even unsure about how an actual convention is going to work. And, the convention is the formal process of nominating someone to run as a Democrat against our Republican opponent. But it's also a week-long pep rally, and it's people getting energized. It's delegates and voters meeting each other, and it gives every candidate that bounce. And depending on who Joe Biden chooses as vice president, it could be a substantial bounce getting us into November, and we've lost some of that, right? We've lost some of that momentum. Even with the endorsement of Elizabeth Warren, the pulling out of the race of Bernie Sanders, all of those things would have been part of a week-long or multi-week news cycle, but it just is part of it's sort of fallen under all of the coverage of the virus. And I understand that it's not a complaint. I get it. If you're too sick or not alive to vote, none of the other stuff really matters, right? So. But the concern is what does Joe Biden do now? What do the Democrats do now to create and sustain some momentum and enthusiasm going in November? And how do the issues and the policies play into that? Look, as for folks who would have preferred to see Bernie Sanders, I would say, to me, Sanders already won. And he won 4 years ago, because things like the way we talk about healthcare, the way we talk about college and higher education is now become part of mainstream policy making across the country. The truth is that right now, there are people sitting down, and maybe not the first time, but for the first time in a while, healthcare is top of mind for every American right now, and the economy as well. But everybody's focused on healthcare, and they're focused on, and they're thinking about, what, was Bernie right? Should we be moving in the direction of Medicare for all or some type of universal healthcare? I don't know that we as Americans come away from this this crisis without wanting our leaders to do more along those lines. Now, it's, I don't know what Joe Biden does should he become president. I think he will. We don't know what Joe Biden does. We don't know exactly what kind of Congress he'll have. But I think particularly in many states across this country, states like New York, others, where you have, again, progressive legislatures and Democratic governors, and maybe some Republican governors. I mean, John Kasich even expanded Medicaid in his state. I have issues with him in other areas, but he even did that. There is going to be a huge push, I think, for a lot of what Bernie Sanders talked about and campaigned on and has been consistent about for the last 40 years. I think you'll see, I hope, let me not say I think, I hope you'll see Biden through the course of this election cycle essentially start to adopt a lot of what Warren and Sanders had been talking about. You saw that a bit with Warren already on student loans. Let's see if he does a little more, particularly on healthcare, or even a hat tip to Andrew Yang in terms of universal basic income, guaranteed income. Let's see where he goes with this. But I do think that there is enough momentum for much more of what Bernie Sanders talked about, unfortunately now because of these focusing events than ever before. But again, it will take Joe Biden in the limited means that he has right now to really start to have that conversation. I would also say that my advice to the Biden campaign and to Democrats broadly, the DNC, is essentially run this race like a parliamentary election. Don't focus on Joe Biden. Focus on what Democrats across the country have been doing. Focus on what the governor of California and governor of New York have been doing, because that's the model, right? It's the governance. It's the ability to be a leader in the midst of a crisis. And if you do that with the juxtaposition of how our president has acted, tweeting, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, right? Stand up for your Second Amendment rights. It's like, wait, what? Which brings me to the second part of this. The president already has a bully pulpit, and he has found and is finding ways to hold his rallies without holding rallies. So he'll send a tweet like, liberate this state, liberate that state. It has nothing to do with stay-at-home orders. That's just a proxy for his ginning up the supporters that he has on these sort of fake issues, so that he can continue to have this ongoing dialogue when he can't physically do rallies. And so we have to, as Democrats, be very careful of that. You see him targeting Michigan because the governor of Michigan is seen as a leading contender for vice president. And so, again, will the policies matter? They absolutely will. I'm concerned about the ability to actually engage in the campaign craft to talk about these issues and really dig deep into them and energize voters. I am concerned about that, but I think as Democrats, we have to find a way around it. And, to go to Vanessa's question in terms of turnout, how does all of this impact turnout? I think normally you would have seen higher turnout than you've seen in a long time. And again, the state's ability to educate voters and improve voter access, potentially by mail-in voting, can have a huge effect on people's fear about, on casting and the ability to cast a vote and get that vote counted, especially if people are still afraid to go outside. And especially if we're still in a stay-at-home order, let's say in January, in June, and it may not really get lifted until the summer. If all of those things could keep the vote down, and we just can't afford that. And I do hope that the governors in these states, particularly here in New York, I'm confident that he understands it, but I hope he really does, and I hope the legislature really does, because if we don't provide the confidence that it's necessary for a voter to step out that door and potentially cast that vote in person, if they can't do that, have we given them the ability to do it by mail? And if not, and if it's not done well, we may substantially hurt our own chances of winning. We'd essentially pull out defeat from the jaws of victory in November.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining again. We've had some newcomers come on, so I just wanted to remind everyone they can put questions into the chat that Basil can go ahead and answer. And also, if there's anyone on the phone who wants to ask a question, you can hit *9, and we can open that up for you. Al, do I need to wait for that, or? Yeah, okay. So, but while we're waiting there, there's a question from Shirai. That's her question is, do you think Texas may be in play if COVID-19 makes a lasting impact in places like Houston?
Will Texas be in play? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wrestle with this a lot, actually. Not just Texas, but Georgia, for example. I think we're moving in that direction, but I don't think we're there by November. You know, I know that there's been, and I talked about Stacey Abrams before and so on, and I wrestle with this. I think Stacey would be a great VP candidate. And there are a lot of folks that say, you know, if we can get her, then Georgia's in play and so on and so forth. I am less optimistic about red states being in play in this cycle. And one of the reasons that I am is because if you think about what's happening in a state that we sometimes get, let's say Florida, just take Florida, for example. That state's governor, in ways of trying to curry favor with the president, has reopened it. There are people swimming in the beaches of Jacksonville as we speak, right? And the point is that every state isn't impacted in the ways that, say, a state like New York and California have been. And so the pressure for those governors and those leaders to act isn't coming necessarily from the, well, I'll just say it this way, is coming from their interest in currying favor with the president. And I'm saying that because if you think about a state like Texas or some of these other states, they're states that would normally vote for the president, for Donald Trump. And I don't know that anything we do in this particular cycle it would get them back. So the way I look at this is you know, can Joe Biden get everything Hillary Clinton got, and then pick up one or two other places, right? Like we can get Michigan, we can get Pennsylvania. There are maybe one or two other states we pick up, and that's really the question for me. Again, when you hear the governor of Alabama, when some weeks ago when he said they weren't going to do a stay-at-home order because they're not California. You have the governor of South Dakota saying they're not doing a stay-at-home order because they're not New York. There is real sort of animosity towards A, blue states, B, coastal states, and we understand why that is, right? And so I'm not really a person who, well, in this particular cycle, I'm quite mindful of how deeply partisan, even during this crisis, we have been as a country. So that's the long way of saying not so sure about Texas in the same way that I'm not so sure about Georgia. And I just want us to, just as Democrats, I think, just focus on everywhere that we got, plus one or two others like Michigan, Pennsylvania, one or two other states, and see where, and hopefully we win that way.
We have a question from Michael Kramer. Do you think that the U.S. Senate can be turned blue?
I go back and forth on this depending on the day. Now, right now, I think there is a sliver of hope. And again, it comes back to how governors and top state leaders have been managing the crisis. Because there's so many people that want to try to curry favor with this president, but then the president's so erratic. It does make that calculus challenging for a sitting senator or governor. And here's an interesting stat. the majority of Americans approve of the way their governor has been managing the crisis. That doesn't mean Democrat or Republican, their governor, right? So if you're in New York, you more often than not approve of how Andrew Cuomo's handling it. But if you're the governor of South Carolina, the majority of the country, majority of folks in your state approve of the way that governor has been handling. It was a Republican governor. Let me say this. That governor has been handling that crisis. But remember, a state like South Carolina, because it's a red state, the top of the ticket for us really is Jamie Harrison, who is running for the Senate, who's a former state chair of South Carolina, and a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine. I know him very well, and he's been a really great candidate. So I'm saying all of that to say that there are a lot of folks there are a lot of governors and a lot of senators who are more popular than the president is, right? And so even if you're a Republican, right? And so I do think there's a sliver of hope though, because I think some of those governors and senators have, in their attempt to curry favor with the president, have just exposed a tremendous amount of hypocrisy and have, because the president's been so erratic and these tweets have been so ridiculous and his handling of this has been so ridiculous, it gives us an opening. So even if we can't carry South Carolina and turn red to blue, we may be able to get somebody like Jamie Harrison into the Senate and get. So there's a sliver of hope for me that we can turn it blue.
So that's a good segue to Velicia's question. How much does Biden's choice of running mate flip red states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera, blue? And if material, who are the top 3 prospects who you think can move the needle, especially in terms of getting the millennial, African-American, and Latino votes in key states?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like I mentioned the governor of Michigan, who is a rising star and has been thrown out as a potential running mate and is sort of, in some ways, even leading that charge right now in some circles. You get her, I think you get Michigan back. And frankly, so let me take it a step back. I know there's also, for African Americans, there's this sense that because Biden owes his candidacy, the fact that he's still a candidate and is now the presumptive nominee, because people feel that he should pick an African American VP, and he said he would pick a woman. So you're talking about someone like Stacey Abrams and stuff. And African Americans are looking very closely at that. There's some concern that African Americans won't come out to vote if it's not an African American woman. I don't know that I buy that, because I think Black folks were some of the early voters to raise the flag about Donald Trump even back in 2015, 2016. So I don't think anything's changed. And in fact, I'm sure African American voters are much more keen on getting him out now than they had been even in the last couple of years. So I don't know that choosing an African American woman necessarily means that African American votes won't come out. But I do look at the narrative that Biden's race is predicated upon, meaning that they have talked from very early on about being able to bring back working class white males, or voters who Obama twice, Trump once. But that working class white voter has been very important to the Biden narrative. If that's the case, to me, his VP might reflect that. So you're talking about someone, like I said, the governor of Michigan. You're talking about somebody like Amy Klobuchar, somebody from some of those Midwestern states. But if he doesn't go that route, does someone like Elizabeth Warren bring out young voters? Absolutely. There's someone, I think. There's someone like Stacey Abrams? Absolutely. And I would also add Val Demings from Florida, the member of Congress who was one of the House managers. She's also a rising star nationally. So, and who also has a very fascinating backstory. She rides a Harley. That's cool. I'm a motorcycle rider. So yeah, you know, so she's just very cool. Former law enforcement. So short answer, who he picks will matter. I don't know that if he doesn't pick an African-American woman, I don't believe that makes Black folks say, well, I'm just not going to vote for him because the stakes are just too high. But I do worry about the constituency that a lot of us are worried about, which is younger voters. There is a candidate there is a person like an Elizabeth Warren and maybe one or two others, Stacey Abrams as well, who he can get that I think energizes younger voters. But if I look at how if I look at again how that his candidacy was predicated upon his ability to bring back these white working class voters, it suggests to me someone else.
Great. So we've got a time for maybe one or two more questions.
Do a lightning
Morton,
round. Do a lightning round.
Yeah, exactly. So please throw your questions in while you can. Hi, Morton. Thank you for adding your question here. And it's a really good one. Do you think that there's a danger in emphasizing COVID pandemic over all else in the presidential race? If governors succeed in flattening the curve and states start to reopen, Trump and his propagandists are going to claim victory and claim all the credit, and the whole dynamic of the race might change by November. Would you agree that the economic issues in the aftermath of the pandemic need to be a focus?
I do actually agree with that because, well, in the same way that I said that right now for so many people, healthcare is top of mind, the economy's right there. And you've got near depression level unemployment. There's real question about what happens when this is all said and done. You had a fund for small businesses run out. There was an article the other day that $30 million of monies meant for small businesses went to big restaurant chains. I mean, people are quite aware of the challenges that are going to be that the economy is going to present for us as we start to come out of this, and that's why you're seeing the president tweet in the way that he is. That's why you see him trying to reopen the country as quickly as he is, because he's concerned. I mean, you had some weeks ago when the economy when the stock market sort of hit bottom, it wiped out all of the gains since he was president. And people are not just aware. I have people concerned that come to me and talk about just the ability to work. But for those professionals that, those sort of high-skilled, the folks in high-skilled jobs who are working from home, they're also concerned about their 401k. They're telling me that their 401k has been wiped out. So everybody across the economic spectrum is concerned about the economy. And I do think leaders are going to have to pivot very quickly and very adept and be very adept at it to how they're going to stabilize their economy. The president, as I've said, is very concerned about this. That's why you see him behaving in the way that he is. But I go back and I think about 9/11 because I was working for Senator Clinton during 9/11. We were down on the pile the day after and talking to business leaders and things like that. And there was a real concern about whether or not New Yorkers would end up leaving the state, when businesses would leaving the state. And then it was Bloomberg who ran on, if you remember, Bloomberg ran on stabilizing the economy, getting New York back to work. And I think that's how Democrats and governors are going to have to talk as we come out of the healthcare crisis and move and focus more on the economic issues. We've got to get people back to work. So yeah, they do have to pivot in that direction. It's got to be quick and they have to be really good at it.
Okay, great. Now I think we're heading into a lightning round. Okay. Is there a way for Biden to ride Cuomo's coattails?
Well, it's like what I said before. I think his campaign and the Democrats, the DNC nationally, should focus on the governors that have been managing this crisis very well. Cuomo chief among them, and California. Let me not slight California, But Cuomo, since we're in New York, we'll talk about Cuomo. Yeah, I would ride Cuomo's coattails as much as he can, because you want to project. Biden needs to project Bill Clinton used to say this all the time. If you're running against an incumbent, you have to convince voters to fire him and hire you. So it's not just enough that we're all against Donald Trump. You have to convince voters that Joe Biden is the right person to replace him. And I think Biden does that by making sure that he pushes positive messages and images of other Democrats across the country, that he'll say, these are the people that I'm going to be working with. And look what they did throughout this crisis. They were leaders, they were executives, they were strong for their states. And I'm going to have a relationship with them that this president doesn't have. So that's the way you do it.
Who would you like to see as Biden's VP?
Yeah, so I have a personal, listen, I know Stacey Abrams, and I love her. She's brilliant. And she actually, interestingly enough, she actually has a plan for how she would be vice president. Not many people actually know the rights and responsibilities of vice president. There are some. And she actually knows this. I would love to see her, Val Demings. I like Amy Klobuchar a lot. And I love Elizabeth Warren. The truth is, and I'm going, can I say this? Can I say this? Elizabeth Warren probably was my candidate, probably. But so would I love to see her vice president? Yes. But, you know, I'd love to see Stacey or Val there as well.
Okay, and do you think that with Barack Obama's endorsement that it will help bring out the African-American vote for Joe Biden?
Maybe Michelle more than Barack at this point, but yes, absolutely. Listen, Barack Obama is the standard bearer of the Democratic Party. He is, you know, people miss him, like people miss him. And I think when he starts to talk about issues of governance and competence, it becomes very evident that the president is not. And you start thinking about what normal really is. We haven't dealt with that in quite some time. So I do think that will encourage African-American votes. But again, because we don't get to do the rallies and a lot of the stuff that we used to do, I wonder what impact it really will have at the end of the day. So it will help, but I'm not sure how much given where we are right now.
Great. Well, I think that wraps up the questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a nice escape from thinking about coronavirus to think about the elections, an important topic in our democracy. I want to let everyone know that we will post the recording of this town hall. There are many of you who joined a little bit later in the conversation. So we'll be posting this to my Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Grace Lee for NYC. So you can get the rest of it there. And, you know, we would love to stay in touch with all of you. We'll be doing other town halls in the future. Next week, I am hosting a special town hall for NYCHA residents with two NYCHA leaders, Jonathan Gardenhire, who's a district leader, and Jasmine Sanchez, who is a housing activist who lives in the Lower East Side, to provide information about how coronavirus has been affecting NYCHA residents and other issues that can impact them. So we'd love to have you join for that as well. You can sign up for our email list, and we can, and we'll have more information about that on the website later this week. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Basil, again.
Pleasure.
This is amazing. We're going to recruit you for some, I think, a DID meeting soon, Richard.
Yeah. You got it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, great. Thank you. Have a great Sunday, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Be safe.